everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Jordan and today I'm going to be doing a review of Nevernight by Jay Kristoff. Okay, so my voice might sound a little bit weird for this review and I apologize, I'm just getting over a cold, and yesterday I did a lot of talking. I actually filmed this review and the audio didn't record, which is super tragic, but we're going to do our best to make it even better today. So hopefully this is a blessing in disguise. So we're going to split this into two sections today. We're going to be doing the short non-spoiler section that I always do, where I just give my overall general thoughts, and then we're going to go into the spoiler section of the review where I talk about all of my thoughts, the nitty-gritty. So I hope you enjoy, and let's just dive into this. Okay, so this book follows Mia Corvier, who is a wannabe assassin dead set on revenge after her father gets killed and her mother and younger brother get sent to a prison where they're likely to die. Mia discovers at a very young age, 10 years old, that she is special. She is a Darkin, so she is able to manipulate shadows and do several things with them, but she's not really aware of her full potential. She basically gets taken under the wing of a retired assassin named Mercurio and trained so that she can one day enter the Red Church, which is basically a kind of church of assassins. Basically, in this book, Mia is trying to become a full-fledged Blade, which is a full member of the Red Church. To do that, she has to enter the school of the Red Church and basically compete with the other students to become a full-on Blade, which there are only 4 per class, and there's about 30 students. So it's very intense, there's lots of action, lots of drama. I actually really enjoyed this book. There are a lot of books that are kind of YA, which I don't think that this is, by the way. I think that this is definitely a new adult book. The protagonist is younger. Mia is 16 in this novel, but it deals with some pretty graphic violence and a few kind of graphic sex scenes, so I would definitely not recommend this to a younger audience. But yeah, I find in a lot of YA and new adult books where there are assassins, they don't end up killing much, and I think that this is because the author wants the protagonist to be still morally good, so even though they're an assassin and they're skilled, they don't necessarily do a lot of killing, and that is not a problem in this book at all, which I really appreciate. Jay Kristoff was able to go really deep and get really dark, and I absolutely love that. On top of this, I really enjoyed the world of this book. It's really unique. It almost feels more like a video game world than a usual kind of medieval high fantasy novel. I think God's Grave, which is where Mia grew up, is derived, I guess, from Catholic Rome, and there are some other cultures that Mia encounters that I think are based off of Vikings as well as kind of more Polynesian cultures, so I think that there's a lot of really interesting cultures at play in this world, which I really appreciate. I also really appreciate how magic was handled in this book. It is definitely present, but it's not always front and center. I love magic where it feels grounded, and there are definite rules and balance, which I appreciate. There's a lot of creatures and fantastical elements, which really add a sense of mystery and darkness to the world, and then the actual magic has very clear rules and balance. So for example, Mia, who can manipulate shadows, can pull shadows around herself and hide herself, but she also can't see. Another example is Muriel, who I will talk more about in the spoiler section. She is able to manipulate people's flesh, but every time she does, her own flesh gets more and more deteriorated and kind of disgusting, so it's this kind of balancing act. I also really enjoyed the plot. I think the first third of the book was a little bit slow, and I would have loved to have seen it progress a little bit faster. I didn't think all of the elements there were necessary, but I did enjoy overall the plot, and I thought that there were some really great twists, especially towards the end, which is where you want the good twists to be. I think there was one twist that wasn't completely deserved, and I'm going to talk about that in the spoiler section, but overall, again, I really enjoyed it. The characters in this book were a little bit hit or miss for me though, and I find that that's often the case. I'm the pickiest about characters over anything, so it's not necessarily shocking, and I find that in any kind of story where there's a school or a bunch of people the same age competing for something, there's definitely going to be characters that are a bit cliche or weak. I'm not surprised by it. I will say though that there were some really strong characters, and I found that the teachers and the members of the Red Church specifically were really interesting and mysterious, and I think that they did a good job of making layered teachers, which you don't always see. On top of that, I think that Trick, who is an acquaintance of Mia's, a friend, friend is another great character. I loved his backstory. We're going to dive more into that in the spoiler section again. Mia herself, I was a bit on and off with. I found that it took a long time for me to connect with her, and then in the end, I don't know if I really know her. I had moments where I really felt connected to her and I really cared about all of her struggles that she was going through, and then I had moments where I felt more distanced. I'm not 100% sold on Mia, who is the protagonist. She's okay, but I didn't love her. So the last thing I'd like to talk about in this short non-spoiler section is the writing. The writing in this novel is, I think, where a lot of people had trouble, and I would say kind of the same for myself. The first few chapters, I honestly wanted to put the book down and just DNF it. It was a lot to get through. It almost felt like Jay Kristoff was just trying to impress the reader by pulling out all these different stylistic things, and the pace was weird. There's also Mia in the past and Mia in the present that he would flip between constantly. It was just a lot going on, and I didn't think that it was necessary, especially because it's a high fantasy world that we were just getting acquainted with, so we were already trying to learn all of the names of all the different places, the world, the characters, and on top of that, he's flipping between the two times, and the writing itself is very flowery and dense, and overall, I thought that the first third of the book, the writing was the weakest, and after that, it found its footing. I did appreciate that in his writing, he does use some very creative descriptions that really give a sense and feeling to the world. Not like, you know, the Scarlet Robe. He'll get really creative with the descriptions of things, but in the beginning, it was a lot more dense, I think, than in the end, and that just made it really hard to get into the story. But I think that's it for the short non-spoiler section. Overall, I really did enjoy this book. There were a few things that I had issues with, but I would definitely recommend it for people who love high fantasy, especially darker high fantasy. It's very violent at times. It feels kind of thrillery at times. There's kind of an ominous feel to it. As I mentioned, I haven't really seen a world like this before, and I thought it was very well crafted. So for anyone who enjoys really interesting, unique world building and fantastical worlds and creatures, I think you'll love this book because I thought that that was handled really well. I also think that people who enjoy very plot-driven, action-driven stories will enjoy this book, and people who are transitioning from YA fantasy to adult fantasy, I think this is another great read for you. Alright, so with that out of the way, let's dive into the spoiler section. So as I mentioned with this book, the writing was difficult at first. I did end up enjoying it in the end, but as I said, it was very slow off the top. The first chapter especially I found to be very annoying, and it definitely left a sour taste in my mouth and had my expectations basically rock bottom. I did not expect to like this book, but I pushed through and I'm very glad that I did. I'm just gonna read the first couple lines of the first chapter so that you get a sense of what the writing's like. The boy was beautiful. Caramel smooth skin, honeydew sweet smile, black curls on the right side of unruly, strong hands and hard muscle, and his eyes, oh daughters, his eyes, 5,000 fathoms deep, pulling you in to laugh even as he drowned you. His lips brushed hers, warm and curling soft. They'd stood entwined on the bridge of whispers, a purple blush pressing against the curves of the sky. His hands had roamed her back, current tingling on her skin. The feather-light brush of his tongue against hers set her shivering, heart racing, insides aching with want. It's very flowery. And that, of course, is the first paragraph, so that's before you really dive into all of the different settings and characters, and so it just becomes a little bit overwhelming. There are also footnotes, which I ended up really enjoying, but I know a lot of people didn't. I did look up a few reviews after I read this book, and it seemed like a lot of people DNF'd it in the first third of the book, and I think that that has a lot to do with the writing style as far as I can tell. The footnotes I found to be really interesting because I love in-depth world building where it discusses history and religion, customs and culture, and that is what I found the footnotes to be good for. I thought they were also really interesting because they were told through the narrator's voice, which is not Mia, by the way. This is a third-person narrator who has a sense of humor, who's kind of witty, and the footnotes are all told through their voice as well, which can add little bits of kind of humor and funny, but also also they're there to really enrich the world. I know a lot of people had trouble with them because it brought them out of the story. I think they're kind of take it or leave it. I don't think you necessarily need to read them to understand what's going on in the story, but I do think that it enriches the experience. So moving on from the writing, I'd love to discuss the world a little bit more. I found that the world was kind of like Assassin's Creed, especially the second one with Ezio, which is in Italy and Rome, and mix that with like Dark Souls with all the creatures and kind of dark magic and all of that. Very ominous kind of elements. And then if you add in like Magic the Gathering land cards, which if you don't know what Magic the Gathering is, it's a card game kind of like Pokemon for adults, and the art for the Magic the Gathering cards is absolutely stunning. I'll insert a few pictures just so you know what I'm talking about, but the land cards specifically are just the most beautiful landscapes, and I think that it's almost like he drew inspiration off of concept art for all the different elements of the world in this book. There's also some really interesting creatures, which I personally love in fantasy novels. Like, for example, there's this huge desert that Mia has to cross with Trick once they meet each other, and there's sand kraken, which are so horrifying. They've got like bone-like claws, and they go and move through the sand and like tear up and eat people. They're horrifying, and I loved it. As I mentioned, I also really loved the magic in this book because it's understated, grounded, and has, even though it's kind of mysterious and Mia doesn't necessarily know all that she's capable of, it has rules and it has balance. And for me, that is the most interesting type of magic. My two favorite magic users are in fact not Mia, but the twins who are albino who work for the Red Church. And so Adonai, the guy, he is basically able to manipulate blood, but to do so, he's able to do a bunch of things. He's able to heal, and basically there's this thing called the Blood Walk, and it's how people from the Red Church move around the world because they have churches all over the place. And so basically he can send people through baths of blood to the other baths of blood set up all over the world. It's super creepy. I love it. But to do that, he has to consume blood, so he's always lusting for blood. He's like a creepy vampire that can do really cool things with dark magic. I love it. And then his sister Muriel, who I mentioned earlier, is able to manipulate flesh, so she's able to make other people really beautiful or really hideous and change their faces and bodies. But then to do that, she becomes super grotesque herself. It just was so well done in this book. Oh my god, I forgot again. Okay. I forgot this yesterday too. It's called Nevernight because it's never night. There are 3 suns instead of 1 in the sky, and it's only ever truly dark once in 4 years because the suns are like constantly rotating. They rotate very slowly around the world, so the suns are in the sky for basically like 3 years at a time. So I think it's like roughly 3.5 years every time it goes dark, and I found that that was really well integrated into the world, not only in how the people act and, you know, days, like how time is measured, but also because it's a huge religious thing in the world. All of the religions are based off of that premise. So the main religion in God's Grave worships Ah, who is the god of light, and his 3 eyes are the 3 suns, so basically he is Ah the Ever-Seeing. And I really love this name, and I'm not sure if this was intentional, but Ah just is like very reminiscent of Ra, who is the sun god in ancient Egypt, so like that just made me happy, even though I'm not sure if that was intentional. I just like found that to be awesome. But moving on, his wife is the Ma, or the mother, and she is the deity of darkness, and so the Red Church worships her. And that's super well integrated into both the Red Church and the society in general, and the way that they battle each other, the magic, everything. All of the world building elements were just so well integrated. I loved the world building in the story, and I found absolutely no faults with it. So moving on, I would like to talk about the plot. Overall, I really enjoyed the plot. As I mentioned in the non-spoiler section though, I found that it was a little bit slow at first, but with any kind of high fantasy story, I kind of give the first like 50 to 100 pages a pass because it's hard, man. It's hard to establish a world and characters and setting, especially one as intricate as this, and have the action be super fast-paced and the story super quick. I don't really mind that the first 100 pages were slow, but I know some people will. So that's worth, considering. While I had an idea of where it was going, I didn't know exactly where it was going to end up, and I was pleasantly surprised at the twists and turns at the end. That being said, there was one twist that kind of bothered me because I didn't feel like it was true to Mia's character, and that's either a fault with the character or a fault with the plot. Basically, at the end, when they're competing to become full blades, Mia ends up kind of manipulating a bunch of the other classmates, and it all pans out in the end. She's manipulated all these people, and she's kind of like revealed herself as this kind of mastermind. And so there's like this whole twist regarding that. I love the setup of the twist. I love that there was this twist. I just didn't feel like I knew Mia to be this manipulative person. I felt like her character up to that point didn't lead me to believe that she'd be able to pull something like this off. She seemed fairly genuine, and while she was a skilled assassin in a lot of the different trades of being an assassin, I didn't feel like manipulation was her strong suit. And on top of that, she seems really intelligent with knowledge things, but her actual like cunning and manipulation, I didn't feel like that was one of her best traits. Sorry guys, my camera just died because I am unprepared. But as I was saying, I didn't love the twist in the end because I didn't feel like Mia was actually that cunning or manipulative, so I didn't necessarily believe that she would be able to pull something like that off. And it seemed to almost weaken her character because it felt like I knew her less. And it made me almost subconsciously distance myself from her because it felt like I didn't know her at all. So that to me was one of the weaker points of the plot. Another thing that I didn't like, and this is a super minor detail, but it drove me insane in the climax of the book. I thought the climax was pretty good. I loved all the action and different elements to it. It was super fast paced. It kept me on my toes. But one element that I absolutely hated was the fact that she seemed to have endless weapons. It made it a lot less tense and stressful because she seemed to have a million throwing knives, a million arrows, and these like kind of chemical poison balls that she could throw that all had different like effects. And so those are from like one of the teachers. She had basically compacted the compounds of these different things, so one of them could explode, one of them could create like smoke bombs, and I think the last one could like sedate people. But she seemed to have an endless supply of them. You never knew how many she had. So I don't know where she kept all of these things, especially because like the climax lasts over several days as she's like trying to save the members of the Red Church once they're betrayed, which I will get into. But like that was so frustrating to me because I feel like it could have been a really cool thing to know exactly as she's running out, as she's using the throwing knives, the crossbow, and all of this stuff. She's running lower and lower. That could have been an interesting element, and instead it just felt like sandbox mode, and she just had whatever she needed, which felt very convenient and frustrating to me. So the big plot twist that I've kind of been referring to and not mentioning is when Mia's friend Ashlyn betrays the Red Church, the group of assassins, and so she and her brother basically sedate all of the teachers and the Lord of Shadows, who is the head of the Red Church, and invite the Illuminati, which are basically like the guard and army of Godsgrave, which is where Mia's from. She basically invites them into the Red Church, completely betrays them, and they do this basically to avenge their father. But yeah, so basically they give up and take down the Red Church, which is a really great twist. It's really awesome. I didn't see it coming, but I thought that it was set up well enough throughout. Like, there was definitely seeds planted so that when the reveal did happen, I was like, that makes sense. I see you. So moving on, last but not least, the characters. Overall, the characters were a bit hit or miss for me. I really would have loved to see, especially because we have the flashbacks, more of Mia's family. And I think that this would have made Mia a lot more relatable, because her revenge story, for me, I didn't necessarily feel it as much as I should have. To me, it was almost like The Revenant, where like we see Mia's family get killed and her mother and brother get taken away to this horrible prison where her mother ends up going insane and her brother ends up being killed, or so we think. And so like we see all of this happen, I should feel a lot more, but because we never actually saw Mia's family together happily, I didn't actually end up forming a bond with any of them, and I felt that that was a huge missed opportunity. If I'd seen her parents and her brother in a more kind of familial setting, casual setting in their everyday life, where we really got to see their bond, I feel like the revenge story would have meant a lot more to the audience. Moving on to Mercurio, who is Mia's trainer, the ex-assassin. I thought he was okay. We didn't really get to see much of him, so I wasn't blown away. I would have loved to see a little bit more depth and a little bit more of their relationship, but he wasn't a huge part of the book, so it's fine. Whatever. Following that, I'd love to talk about the members of the Red Church. So, as I mentioned in the non-spoiler section, I really liked the teachers in general, but two specifically, and those two are Shahid Mouser and Chiquita Leia. Shahid Mouser is the teacher of thievery and escape and lockpicking, all of that good stuff, which is essential to being an assassin, and I thought that his character had a lot of depth, like hinted at. He was still very mysterious, but he definitely had a soft spot. He seemed very layered, and he seemed the most human of all of them. Moving on to Chiquita Leia, and she is the teacher of seduction and manipulation. She's the one who gets secrets and teaches the art of making love. I loved her. She was super mysterious, but she definitely had human elements. It was great that they hinted that she was once ugly, but now, because of the work of Muriel, she's this enchantress. And I just love those layers and the kind of look at what self-confidence can do, what changing your outward appearance can do to oneself. It was all just very interesting to me, and I really liked the depth that was hinted at with her. The other two, Shahid Spiderkiller, who is the teacher of poisons, she was a fine. There wasn't really much there. She was pretty one note. And the same can be said for Shahid Solace, who was the teacher of weaponry and fighting and all of that. He was also kind of one note. They're both a little bit more dark and villainous, more assassin-like in my mind. They were serviceable. Mother Drusilla is the kind of matriarch of the church. She's not the head. The head is Lord Cassius, who is the King of Shadows. We'll talk about him in a second. But Mother Drusilla was also very interesting to me because she's described as this sort of like nice, warm, granny-ish type lady. Like, she's older, she seems very welcoming, she completely disarms you, and then she's got this super dark undertone and edge to her that's really interesting. I kind of love badass grannies, so that's like a weakness to me, so maybe that's why I loved her so much, but I thought she was great. Then we have the Lord of Shadows, and I'm almost disappointed because he ends up dying in the end, which I thought was an interesting choice, but I would have loved to see just a little bit more of him because I was so intrigued by his character, and I think that there were stories that I would have loved to see. But he is also a Darkin like Mia, and he also has a shadow companion, which, by the way, Mia does. She has a shadow cat named Mr. Kindly, and he has a shadow wolf, and the shadow wolf ends up joining Mia in the end. So I feel like we'll get hints of Lord Cassius's character through what we hear from the wolf in future books, which I'm excited about. Moving on, we have the students, and this is where there's the most hit or miss kind of elements. There's the mean girl, that's Jessamine. She's like the evil redhead who's cunning and good with, you know, fighting and stuff. She was just like kind of evil, and I feel like her character could have been so much more interesting because of all the parallels with Mia. Her father was a soldier who had fought in the rebellion which Mia's father had created, and her father ended up dying in that rebellion. Mia instantly was like, oh my gosh, we're so alike. Both of our fathers died for this cause, and Jessamine instantly was like, no, my father died because of your father. So there's this instant tension between them. There's this history, and I loved that. I would have been fine with seeing Jessamine be this kind of cliche cartoon evil girl if in the end, because they're forced to connect and fight together, they had a moment. Like, I really like endings that kind of, you know, not necessarily tie things up with a bow, but a little bit, where it feels like there's at least a little bit of resolution. And I feel like they had the opportunity because Jessamine and Mia are forced to fight together in the end. I would have loved to have seen a moment of connection where something is resolved between them because I feel like it was missing that. Okay, but moving on from Jessamine, we have Ashlyn. She's the one who ends up betraying the church. I thought her character was interesting. I just would have loved to have seen a little bit more development between her and Mia in the early stages of the relationship. I felt like it kind of went from 0 grow to being best friends really quickly, and that development phase was kind of important and was missed out on. And that can be said for a lot of the characters, I think. Because there were so many time jumps in this book, because it's, you know, a training progression, all of the relationships seem to have been built very quickly, and the same can be said for Carlotta, who is Mia's other friend that's an assassin, and who ends up dying. And I feel like her death would have been a lot more impactful had their relationship been more of a slow progression. And that brings me to Trick. And I loved Trick. I thought his backstory was so fascinating. I thought he was such a defined character. I really knew who he was. He also ends up dying, which was devastating, because also, like, his death was just like, it was like a paragraph. It happened so fast. I was not expecting it. It came out of the blue. I was like, ugh. And I feel like everyone was expecting him to come back, because it's like, no, it can't just be that. It was that. It was a lot. But anyway, I feel like there was one thing that would have made Trick so much more likable, because it took me a long time to really connect with him. It took me till he really opened up and shared his backstory for me to like him and connect with him, because the author basically threw him and Mia together. They're trying to figure out how to get to the Red Church. They don't know where it is, and so they climb this tower, and they end up spending 2 weeks at the top of this tower waiting to see something in the Whisper Wastes below, which is the desert, and he skips over all of it. There are 2 weeks where Mia and Trick get to know each other, and they go from not knowing each other at all to being pretty good acquaintances, and we get to see none of it. I would have loved to have seen some character moments between them in that time, but he just skips over all of it. And it's like, no, I want it, because he's kind of a love interest to Mia, so I want to see the progression. You can't just have 0 to, like, being basically friends. That's not how this works. You missed a chunk. You missed a very important chunk there, Jay Kristoff. That really drove me nuts. That made me like, We got there in the end. I really liked Trick in the end, but I feel like that would have been important in getting to know and loving Mia as well, not just Trick. Like, I feel like the character dynamic between the two of them would have been really good in those moments, but it just didn't happen. It's fine. In the end, I did really like Trick. I thought he was great, but I think we were missing out on that one moment that I think would have made him even more likable sooner. And that brings me to, last but not least, Mia. So Mia, again, I had a bit of an on and off relationship with, because it took me a long time to connect with her. And I think that might be partially because of the writing style. I tend to prefer, and this is just personal preference, first person if it's done well, obviously. But this is third person, and not only that, it's told from a narrator who is definitely, they've got a character. So when it's third person, but the narrator isn't as present, I find it's even slightly then more easy to connect with the main character. But when the narrator does have an actual character, I find it a little bit hard to connect with the main character sometimes. And I was actually surprised, because I did end up connecting with Mia, especially for the middle section of the book. And then in the end, again, there was that twist that I just felt came out of nowhere with her character. I didn't feel like I knew her to be that person, to be able to manipulate and, like, set up all of these things. So when that happened, I was like, oh, do I actually know Mia? And then it almost, because that's kind of when the climax started to kick off, so that's when we got all of the action bits and stuff, so it didn't feel like we had character moments after that for me to reconnect with Mia and feel like, oh no, okay, I got it, I know who she is. It was just like, it jumped from me being pulled out of her character to a bunch of action sequences, so I felt like I really got to know her in the middle section, and then I felt disconnected from her again in the climactic bit, which is not what you want at all. So that was kind of my beef with Mia. On top of that, I felt mixed about the flashbacks to the past, because some of them didn't necessarily need to be there. Like, I felt like it could have been a lot shorter, or there almost should have been more. I just felt like there was a weird number of flashbacks. They definitely eased off about halfway through the book, and it almost felt more like just to give exposition and get to know Mia rather than really enriching, engrossing parts of the story. There was like one, which is the True Dark Massacre, that I was like really into, and all of the other ones just felt like they were there to really give exposition so that we understand where Mia came from. So they felt almost more like lazy writing devices than actual engaging story for me. So that was my other beef with Mia. I feel like that was not the best way to get to know her character. I'm 50-50 on those. Like, I didn't mind them, but I also didn't love them. Alright guys, so that is all I have to say about Nevernight. I really did enjoy this book. I'm looking forward to reading God's Grave, which is the second one in the series. I'm gonna pick it up real soon, and I'm looking forward to reading it so that I can bring another review to you and keep you updated on how this series is. But as I said, I really did enjoy the series. I would recommend it to fantasy lovers, especially people who are interested in different, interesting, unique worlds. Things that are a little bit darker, have some kind of thrillery elements, and a lot of action and adventure. If you have read this book, I would love to hear your thoughts on it in the comment section below. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope to see you next time. Bye!